Hi, everyone. We are going to give it just a minute or two to make sure that everybody who wanted to be here for the live stream arrives. So probably start at about 10:01, 10:02 with the actual talk. Thanks for your patience. And it's nice to see you all here, sort of see you here. Okay. So I want to thank you all for joining me here today. This is the first seminar for FISH 513, Cultivating Inclusive Conservation Practices. There will be more seminars to come as the quarter goes along, so please stay tuned for more advertisements that you see come your way, or you can also find any of those videos on this YouTube channel, ones that were previously recorded or upcoming events as well. I would like to start off by thanking the university and the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences, in addition to the Campus Sustainability Fund, for making this seminar possible. I really appreciate the work and help and support that you've given. And if anybody that's watching is interested in sort of following along with the readings that we're doing in the actual seminar, they are posted on the class website, and that link is in the video description below. And just a note to folks more broadly, the video does not currently have closed captioning enabled, but I will be adding those to the videos later on. So I'd like to first start off with a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. At every seminar in this quarter, I'm going to strive to learn and share more about the unceded territory upon which I live and work in the Coast Salish peoples that are part of the past, present, and future of this area. But I would first off like to say, with Indigenous Peoples Day coming up on Monday, I set the intention for myself to learn more about the people on whose land I occupy, and to also better know what actions I can take to empower Native people every day of the year and not just on settler colonial holidays. So I would encourage other non-Native people to join me in this endeavor as well. That being said, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. I'm very lucky to be able to have him here. I met David Muñoz when I was in grad school and have been really grateful and benefited a lot from his perspectives and knowledge over the course of the years, and I'm really excited to be able to share that with you all today. So David received his doctorate at Penn State University and focused on understanding range-wide responses of wildlife to global change. He is currently a research and equity specialist at Penn State, where he works to create cultural and structural change for the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management. He also currently runs his consulting business focused on the intersection of community, collaboration, and conservation. Through community building, partnerships, and addressing the problematic practices of conservation, David is working on his vision where people and planet can thrive together. So I would like to introduce David and let him take it on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stacy, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm excited to share with you today something I've been thinking about a lot, and that's the role of anti-racism in conservation, and specifically how we can use anti-racism as a framework to address more systematic problems. So I've got some of my contact information on the slide. Before I dig into things, I want to add a couple disclaimers. So first is that this talk is going to have a very US-centric focus. So for any international folks who are attending or watching this video, hopefully you'll be able to see some of the common threads that result from colonialization, but common threads too that you can apply in your own systems. And second, my second disclaimer is that I've made this talk primarily for white folks. So for fellow people of color who are watching, I hope maybe you discover some empowering language or this is affirming for you, but just know that I'm addressing this primarily to white folks in conservation. So with that said, I've got a few learning outcomes for this talk. As I said, I'm going to be providing a framework, and so I'm hoping that this framework coming at the beginning of your seminar series is helpful for viewing all the great talks that are to come throughout the rest of the course of this quarter. But some of my learning outcomes for today, so by the end of my talk, I hope we'll all be able to explain the importance of systems thinking in addressing inequity. We'll all feel more comfortable defining race, racism, and anti-racism. We'll be able to recognize the ways in which racism has shaped our field of conservation. And we'll touch and end on ways in which we can evaluate the systems we operate in using anti-racism as a framework. So those are my learning outcomes. You'll be able to tell me how well I do, but let's get started. So one reason I really like talking about systems thinking, especially with folks in ecology and conservation, is that our minds are sort of already primed for this. We think a lot in models. We recognize the use of models in systems thinking. And as a field, we're generally trying to seek connections and figure out relationships between things. We have a big focus on discovering structure and pattern in the systems we work in. We value the feedbacks that sort of support or don't support those systems. And we often have this desired outcome of biodiversity, especially on the conservation side. So despite having this great priming for thinking about systems and thinking about some of the outcomes we want, like biodiversity, a lot of the things that I think about is, why is it so hard to think about diversity in other ways in our field? And so that's sort of what I'm going to focus on today. And one of the reasons that we struggle to think about diversity is that we often view diversity as both an outcome and a method. So diversity, is the collective group's traits, backgrounds, experiences. We often have this goal of increasing representation, increasing the number of different types of people and their experiences in our groups. But the problem is that we don't necessarily always use the methods that we need to. So using some of the lingo in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, the way that I view some of the methods is equity, which is really about resources and opportunities, justice, which is about power structures, and then inclusion, which is about culture. And so today I'm mainly going to be focusing when I talk on justice and equity and how those play a role in anti-racism and shaping a better conservation. So these methods lead and build a healthy outcome of diversity. But there's also this tricky part, right? Of often people from marginalized backgrounds are best able to see the connections necessary to put justice in action and equity in action and inclusion in action. And so it's a two-way street, but often we only focus on this outcome, which is diversity, and we also use it as a method. And so really to be successful, we need to make sure that we're approaching it from a more entrenched standpoint as well. And so my role today, I'm honored to be the first speaker in this seminar series. But I really love this quote from the poet Ada Limon. Will you tell us the stories that make us uncomfortable, but not complicit? And one reason I really like this quote is that talking about these things is uncomfortable. It might not be something that we have a lot of practice in. It might be something new. It might be something that's traumatic for us to think about. So there's definitely a lot of discomfort when talking about issues of equity and justice. But I also want to focus more on complicit. How do we participate in the structures that oppress and marginalize? And how can we see that through a systems thinking approach, we all play a role in the systems around us? So with this quote, I'll also like to say I'm going to be pushing you all today. I'm going to be trying to, open the door in your mind to think about things a little bit more broadly. And so that is how I view myself today in the seminar talk. And right, complicit, we participate in the structures around us. And so I'm just going to give a really basic approach of how I think about systems thinking and also how systems thinking can guide us. And some of the things we're going to be talking about is mental models, structure, and feedbacks. And so mental models, a simple definition is our idea of how something works. We have the system in our head, we take some action, and we expect some type of outcome. And in conservation, we have a lot of mental models. You know, from the preservation mentality, we have this mental model of fortress conservation, where if we remove people from a system, that's what's best going to serve nature. And so whether we can think about it as national parks or protected areas, we have this mental model that our action is set aside land as protected area, and that leads to the best outcome. In North America and the United States, we have the North American model of conservation, which is sort of the user pay public benefit. So hunters and trappers and anglers pay their fees in order to be able to partake in the resource. And by the fees that they generate and by the role that they play, we have some benefit for conservation overall. So we got this fortress conservation model. We have the North American model of conservation. And then we have other forms that are gaining traction, like rights-based conservation, which pairs human rights and environmental rights together, and how that's a positive framework for making sustained, lasting positive change for common goals. So we have these mental models. They're in the back of our mind. We might not always be aware of them, but they're there. And so what comes with these mental models are things like assumptions, values, beliefs, and behaviors. And so from these mental models, we have how we view the world around us and how we act in that world. And so from this action and from these beliefs, we create structures and we create feedback. So in structure, we can think about something like hierarchy versus co-production. And if we apply this to some of the mental models I've already mentioned, you know, hierarchy is totally the approach of fortress conservation, where people who view the problem in a certain way or think they have a certain solution come with a top-down approach on who has access to a given land, versus something like rights-based conservation is more co-production. The definition of the problems are jointly made and the solutions are jointly found. So we create some type of structure from our mental model. And we also create feedback systems, whether this is a policy or an action or a narrative. We either create things that challenge or support our mental models and structures. And so either this perpetuates them or eventually dismantles them. And so when we think about questions of diversity and we apply this basic approach of systems thinking, one of the reasons why it's so hard to think about it is that we don't necessarily view issues of diversity from a mental model, structural, or feedback perspective. We sort of ignore the fact that maybe there's these systems and narratives that perpetuate the way things are. And so when we think about systems and narratives, sort of the crucial currency of this is who has power, who's given value or resources, and who's given dignity throughout the process. And so we might move down this level to think about feedbacks, such as marginalization, oppression, or exploitation. But typically, all we see is this really passive term of underrepresented, or how we view diversity. And so we typically are, once again, viewing things as an outcome or as the state that we can't really understand, without viewing things at a higher level, such as the systems and narratives or the feedback processes that create this outcome. So thinking about what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to highlight some ways in which we can think about equity and justice, so addressing power structure and addressing resources, and how we can apply that in a systems thinking framework to address issues of diversity. So moving into the next part of my talk here, we're going to define race, racism, and anti-racism. And a lot of the ways I'm going to be defining these are based off of how Ibram Kendi defines these in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But just wanted to start off with this quote from him as we move into this anti-racist framework, is that being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular examination. And so we need to put in the work and put in the reflection to be able to see how racism and anti-racism play out in the conservation system around us. So race, Kendi defines race as a power construct that uses collected or merged differences and lives socially. So we're making some sort of groupings, that's this collected and merged part, but it leads to power. And one way we can define power, it's the ability to act in a certain way, but also in order to direct the course of events and the behavior of others. So we come up with some differences or similarities. We make that into a power construct, so that way we can have influence over the course of events or the behavior of others. And this live socially part means that this definition is constantly changing, how we define those differences or similarities and how we use that power in new ways. But ultimately, race is about power, and how it's defined is about power. And perhaps this is really clear in how sort of our field's own complicit nature in defining race is that this was codified by biologists. So Carl Linnaeus, he had his whole theories of the different varieties or races of human and the traits that go with them. And while we might find the traits laughable today, we can't ignore the fact that this is still kind of the system we use to define race. And so these definitions from early on still sort of haunt us in the present. Even Ernst Haeckel, who coined the term ecology, was big into the pseudoscience of biological races and used that as his view for how he viewed evolution in the systems around us. So our field is complicit in defining this power construct. Moving ahead to racism. So Kendi defined, I've sort of modified Kendi's definition here, but racism is the combination of policies, structures, and ideas that produce and normalize racial inequities. And so what I want to highlight here is that, we're thinking about policies, structures, and ideas whose outcome is inequities. So this gets back to sort of the mental model. And we've been living through this pandemic. If we haven't seen the racial inequities that exist in our society before, we certainly see them now, whether that's through our healthcare system, mortality from COVID, whether that's in our financial system and who's losing jobs and who's got the support networks. And so throughout all of our systems, whether it's financial, health, criminal justice, we see racial inequities. And so we need to think about the forces that created those. And we'll see in just a few minutes how those forces shaped inequities in our own field of conservation. So we've got race, we've got racism. Now, how does Kendi describe racist and anti-racist? So on one end of the spectrum, we've got one who is supporting a policy, structure, or idea through action or inaction that creates or perpetuates racial inequity. So that's the definition of racist. I definitely want to highlight inaction, right? The status quo is that our systems racialize and oppress people. And so if we do nothing, that supports those systems and supports that status quo. So inaction is a big part of that definition. Versus on the other end, we have anti-racist is one who's supporting a policy or structure idea that generates racial equity. And so building off the ideas of Angela Davis and other thinkers before him, Kendi has this quote that there's no such thing as not racist. There's no in-between state of neutrality. So within myself, I have racist tendencies and have anti-racist tendencies. And all I can do is work and commit and put myself out there to put forth an anti-racist vision and put forth anti-racist action to generate racial equity. And so some of this is we need to desensitize ourselves to the term racist and not get so defensive when we hear it, because through our inactions or inactions, we can either be supporting racism or anti-racism. And one reason that we have a hard time thinking about this stance of no neutrality is that typically we think of white supremacy and racism as these very violent or overt acts, such as the ones at the top of this pyramid, but we don't think necessarily about all of these concepts at the bottom of this pyramid as also supporting white supremacy and our complicit nature in it. So there's a lot on here, but I do just want to point out a few. So a couple that I'll mention later on is it supports white supremacy to not believe the experiences of people of color. And it also supports white supremacy that intentions are good enough, that maybe if I'm just nice enough or kind enough, that dismantles racism. So those are two I'll touch back on later in this talk. In my next section of the talk, things that I'm going to discuss are, I've added this idea here of biological races and how that's overt white supremacy. I'm going to talk a little bit about anti-immigration policies and practices and how that plays into conservation and its founding. But also this idea of the white savior complex, that only certain people have the ability to create a solution or especially save nature from humanity. So some of these ideas I'm going to highlight throughout the rest of this talk. So we've got a basic understanding of some systems thinking, mental models, structures, feedback. We've got these definitions of race, racism, and anti-racism. And now we're going to apply that to conservation, and we're going to see how racism has been a core ideology of our field since its founding in the United States. And once again, adopting some of the thoughts of Kendi here, thinking about racism as power, he defines racism as being suited or based off of self-interest. So we have some sort of self-interest. We use racism as a power construct to enact some type of policies to serve that self-interest, and that leads to some inequitable outcome. And so a couple questions to keep in the back of your mind as I go through the next few slides here is sort of what were the self-interests of conservation's founders? Can we make connections between those self-interests to the policies and actions that they followed, using race as a power construct? And then is the outcome racial inequity? So those are just some questions to keep in the back of your mind. So to provide some context, right, in the United States, sort of the birth of the conservation movement happened during the Industrial Revolution. So it was a period of some really massive change in our country. And conservation founders had sort of these prevailing ideas that cities and really dense human populations were a scourge, that nature was sort of a refuge from this human problem, and that wilderness is really a hallmark of civilization. And so if we're to be civilized, we should have nature as this refuge. And some of the underlying myths or narratives that have sort of been born out of that and that we still see today in our conservation movement is that sort of overpopulation destroys the environment, and that really we should be thinking about whose populations are growing and how we can control that. So that's one narrative that's sort of the founding of our conservation field still perpetuates today. We have this other myth or narrative that humanity is somehow separate from nature. It's this refuge where no other humans belong, and that's where its power lies. And then lastly, the myth and narrative that's supported from this founding is that only those who are civilized should have access to these spaces. And so the exclusionary practices that sort of were born out of conservation from this narrative. So in the next few slides, I'm going to cover three different sort of founding thinkers or important individuals in the United States conservation movement. And I'm going to sort of tie some of the quotes that we think of regarding them, but also quotes that we don't think of regarding them, to some of these myths and to some of those ideas regarding white supremacy. So to start, John Muir, very important individual in influencing the direction of some of our national parks and founding the Sierra Club, which is a dominant environmental organization with the United States. But we have this quote that, you know, we find inspirational, or that we think of as a typical inspirational environmental quote, of that thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out going to the mountains is going home, that wilderness is a necessity. But quotes that we don't necessarily think about, although we're engaging with them more now, is this quote from him that it can never have been the intention of God to allow Indians to rove and hunt over so fertile a country. And so here we have two narratives popping to the forefront. One is that humanity is separate from nature. So this is his over-civilized people, separate from wilderness, separate from nature, need to go find it and seek it as a refuge. But two, who he defines as people is, you know, racially driven. So his views of indigenous and native tribes led to his policy of removal and theft of lands. And this was motivated by his belief in biological races and sort of this white savior complex. And so we've got these myths that support his beliefs, they support his actions, and he uses race as a policy and as a power construct to achieve his own self-interests. Gifford Pinchot, so moving from preservation to the conservation mindset, we have this quote from him: "The purpose of conservation is the greatest good to the greatest number of people for the longest time." And, you know, Gifford Pinchot went to be instrumental in the US Forest Service and how we view management of our natural resources. But once again, we come to this problematic definition of who does Gifford Pinchot see as people. And here in this report that he chaired, it says, "If our nation cares to make any provision for its grandchildren and its grandchildren's grandchildren, this provision must include conservation in all its branches, but above all, the conservation of the racial stock itself." And from a quote like this, it's no surprise that Gifford Pinchot was heavily involved in the eugenics movement, which I'll go into a little bit more on my next slide. But once again, we have this myth that natural resources only serve the select few because only certain people deserve the right to have access to them. And this was fundamentally driven by his views of biological races and a white savior complex. So I couldn't give a talk to a School of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences without talking about a fisheries person. So David Starr Jordan was in charge of the Pacific Coast for the U.S. Fisheries Commission in the 1880s. First president of Stanford University, was also really involved in the California Fisheries Commission. And on this committee he was on, we have this more uplifting quote that the citizen is the better one who leaves to the next generation a better world than he found. But at the same time, David Starr Jordan was on the eugenics committee of the American Breeders Association. Excuse me. He worked to limit Chinese and Chinese American fisheries in California because he viewed that it was their fault for the decline of fisheries, even though it's at fault of a broader system of how fish were harvested, right? That was the market era of how we managed our resources. And he was also really instrumental in the sterilization program in California. And so he perpetuated and enacted on these narratives that certain people shouldn't have the right to breed, shouldn't have the right in reproductive rights, that overpopulation destroys the environment. But once again, that only certain people should have access to the nature and natural resources around us, building off of these ideas of biological races, the white savior complex, and anti-immigration policies. All right, so we've got these three individuals. We've seen some of their self-interests. We've seen sort of their ideology and how that plays into white supremacy and how they used white supremacy to create some of the policies that we've seen in our conservation world. But I just want to iterate that like some of this isn't history. It's great to talk about historical figures and understand how our past has shaped our present, but a lot of these same myths and narratives are still being perpetuated. So in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, Sierra Club was dealing with individuals on its board that wanted to make anti-immigration policy a core tenet of the organization, because their thought was that immigrants are having too many babies. And so if we keep immigrants out, we can protect our environment. So thankfully, those initiatives weren't successful, but this is still building off those myths, perpetuating those myths, and having that white savior complex that is rampant in our conservation field. So it's not just history. And so if we move a little bit into some of the broader policies of the conservation movement, we can think about the North American model. And one of the core tenets of the North American model is that wildlife belongs to everyone, that we've democratized the process of who gets to be involved in wildlife and wildlife conservation and the natural resources. But thinking about hunting and hunting regulations, one of the first motivations for hunting regulations was to restrict who had access to wildlife. So here, thinking about Virginia's first hunting regulation, flyers were put out that said, such restriction keeps out of the fields a class that should not hunt, or excuse me, that should not, under any circumstances, have the right to hunt. And it provides the disarmament of a multitude of town and Negro loafers, forcing them to legitimate pursuits during the hunting season, which of course in the South, legitimate pursuits was sharecropping and farm labor. So how can we keep people out of the field? How can we restrict and make hunting and our natural resources exclusive? And how can we use race to do so? Similarly, some of the other key policies during this time, so thinking about the Morrill Act that created the land grant institutions, right? All these lands were from theft of indigenous land and breaking treaties. We could think about the Homestead Act, which led to a lot of the farming families and creation of the agrarian society in the United States, but that Black people were excluded from the Homestead Act. So they didn't get access to land and access to what land brings. And so the policies that our country has enacted is built off of this history of treaty breaking and discriminatory practices, because, right, it's founded off this self-interest, and some of that self-interest is white supremacy. And right, these same habits are still going on today. So a couple modern examples. So, you know, just this summer, the Washington State Supreme Court is still addressing past wrongs, especially in regarding to fishing rights and tribal rights. So this related to Yakama Nation fisheries. In the 1990s, the Maka tribe had its first whale hunt since whales were put on the endangered species list. And when they did this hunt, there was tons of protests from environmentalists saying that they shouldn't have the right to the rights of their treaty and the rights of their culture. And so we still are grappling today with the ideologies and practices that have sort of been built into our conservation movement. So moving to the consequences of this, similar to how I talked about at the beginning, we view this as a diversity issue or an underrepresented issue. We see statistics like this, that 97% of hunters are white, or 87 or 86% of anglers are white, or that the majority of family forest landowners or farmers are white. And we say, oh gosh, that's too bad. I wonder why that's the case. And we're ignoring the systems that created the policies, that enacted the policies, and that created the feedback loops that led us to where we are today. And we see that too in the conservation field of who's in environmental organizations, who's in STEM, who's in our departments. And so they're all one and the same. And so just to summarize and sort of bring this all back together, thinking about US conservation policy, thinking about the self-interest of conservation's founders and how that's sort of propagated through time, I had these three questions. What were their self-interests? How did they use race in the policies and actions that they took? And how did it lead to racial inequity? So here's sort of my quick summary of it. So we think about self-interest. One of the primary ones is that only the privileged should have access to nature or our natural resources. And we're going to use exclusionary practices to support that access. And that access is fundamentally built off of these concepts of biological races and white savior complex. And of course, whether preservation or conservation, it's all about who has control of nature and its resources. When we think about policy, we can see our mental models coming back up. We've got things like fortress conservation, where we exclude people from the land that might have been theirs historically. We exclude people from having access and livelihood. Or we can think about our North American model of that. Who did we try and preserve the right for hunting or the right to natural resources? So those are sort of policies and how those mental models have come into being. And what's the outcome, right? We saw those stats about the outcome of who makes up sort of these constituencies, but they're perpetuated, and this inequity has continued to be perpetuated by serving narrow constituencies. Like maybe we're not thinking about stakeholders, maybe we're not thinking about who has rights to these resources. And so it sort of preserves the myths that were generated in the conservation movement's founding. And this inequity is about maintaining power. All right, so I know I've covered a lot. We started with thinking about systems in a broad sense, thinking about mental models, structures, and feedbacks. We gained some understanding of race, racism, and anti-racism, and how that can play into a system, because power is all about how a system works. We've applied that lens to conservation as a field. We've seen how those self-interests, we've seen how that ideology has shaped our policies, how it's led to racial inequity and outcomes. And so hopefully I've convinced you that conservation is a system, but more importantly, that it's a racist system, and that we have a lot of work to do if we're to change it into something that's anti-racist. And so to close out, just a couple general directions, and once again, a framework for how we can think about what an anti-racist conservation would look like. And it's really built on some of these tools. So justice, equity, and inclusion. And so I'm gonna give two actions that are really simple. The first of which is actually listen. So this quote from Audre Lorde here is that when we, being people of color, when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid to speak. So it's better to speak. And so when your colleagues or your communities are putting their voices out there, are sharing their experiences, it's often coming at great personal cost to them. And so the least you can do is actually listen and hear what they're saying and learn from what they're saying. Because, right, if we go back to that pyramid, not believing the experiences of people of color supports white supremacy and supports racism. The second is do the work. So this quote here from James Baldwin, they, this being about white Americans, they are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. When we think about race, right, where this is a mental model, there's assumptions, there's beliefs, there's values, and we don't necessarily have the skills or the practice questioning those values or assumptions. or changing those mental models in our head. And so personal transformation is a necessary ingredient to creating an anti-racist future. Just like we go through a ton of scientific training, master's degrees, PhDs, internships, in order to understand how the environment works, so that way we can make practical environmental solutions, we need to put in the work to understand our own roles, our own identities, our own privilege, our own power in the society around us. Because if we don't do the work, we're missing that necessary ingredient. So those are the two easy ones, listening and doing the work. Once again, coming back to Kendi and some of his ideas, if we do not think of race as a power construct rooted in self-interest, propagated by policy, not individual behavior, we will fail to be successful. We can't think of race as, oh, that individual is just racist, or, you know, I'm gonna do my best, or, you know, all these little instances of individual behavior. That doesn't add up to be enough. We have to think about things on a systematic standpoint. And I think that's where Kendi's going with this quote. It ties back to the mental models and back to systems. Being good is not good enough because there's these larger systems that are propagating harm and propagating oppression. So we need to take bigger actions, either through policy or through the structures of our systems, in order to change things. We have to think about power dynamics and who has power. So I'll have some questions here at the end, sort of heuristics for you to use. But who has power in your systems? Who do you give power to? In the projects you do, what communities have a say? And how can we change those power structures? And lastly, what feedbacks are we propagating, either through the narratives that we share or through the policies that we put in place in our institutions and organizations? And so while we have these personal actions, like actually listening and doing the work, those build up to being able to take actions that address these larger systems and these larger power structures. And so in your own work, just some questions to consider is, you know, who is giving access and opportunity? So is it a local group who's giving you access to their resource? Or is it citizen or community-based scientists who are giving you their free labor to do your work? And what's the flow of resources and opportunity? Does it go both ways? And is it equitable? Thinking about justice in your work, who gets to define the problem? Is it just conservationists and environmentalists? And are they taking that problem and applying it to communities? Or do people from those communities actually get to help define what's going on? Because ultimately, it's whose interests does your work serve? Is it serving both people and the people who are marginalized by our field? Or does it serve primarily just yourself? Control. Who gets to select the solutions in our conservation work? Do those solutions generate equity or justice? Who benefits? Who doesn't? Things to think about and reflect on in the conservation work that we do. And then lastly, from more of an inclusion standpoint, of who has their values listened to and acted upon? Do we bring stakeholders in, but only as a show? Or do we actually dignify them in the process and allow their input to shape the outcomes that we come to? And so some future directions that you can also think about to sort of do that personal work, but also think about how to apply that in your own conservation work, is do some learning on rights-based conservation, work with groups who do things from a rights-based conservation framework and mental model, engage with people doing the work, doing environmental and climate justice work. You know, my own research looked at how animals are being affected by climate change. And it wasn't until later on in my own development that I was like, I can't really think or do work about climate change if I'm not also thinking about the people who are affected most by it and how by helping them, I can also help some of the critters that I care about. So engage in these communities and change our mental models. And then lastly, engage with decolonizing science, the act of giving back people their rights, whether indigenous or local communities. How can we approach things from a human rights and indigenous rights framework? Because anti-racism is a sister framework to this, right? Racism is a colonial idea. And so how can we work together in decolonizing the field that we're a part of? And so all of this ultimately is about changing our mental models and how we do the work that we do. So to wrap things up, got our learning outcomes. Hopefully you feel like you've gained a better understanding regarding these learning outcomes. So understanding the importance of systems thinking, understanding these topics of race and racism, recognizing how racism has shaped where we are today in conservation. But really, I viewed my role in my talk today as helping maybe set the stage for the rest of the seminar series. So although I didn't provide any examples, I think we're going to have a whole seminar series of people who've been thinking really hard about how they apply this in their own work. But if you'd also like to do some more work on your own, I've got this QR code and this link here of some reflection questions that you can go through related to these topics to do some of your, improve your own understanding. So with that, I would just like to say thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to both my colleagues and the writers and thinkers who have come before me who have helped me really grow in my own understanding of these issues. So with that, yeah, I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, David. I'm sure that the world is hearing the applause right now in a way that we can't, unfortunately, on Zoom. But thank you so very much for your time. We really appreciate you coming in and talking to us. If anybody has any questions, you should feel free to put them in to the YouTube live chat, or the students of the class can put them into the Slack channel. And I'll maybe just get us started on one. We're probably only going to be able to really take 2 questions so that we have enough time afterward for students enrolled in the class to talk. But one of the things that I've sort of encountered myself and seen a lot of white conservationists encounter again and again is how do we sort of balance and weigh the information we get from people who were very complicit in racially based, racially prejudiced societies and doing that work, but also doing work that could be good in the conservationist movement. So how to try and kind of weigh the good with the bad and know when and how to celebrate good that was done as well.
Yeah, and I think, so first, I think it's easy to take this read of, understanding the eugenics or the preservation and conservation policies from our founders and view this critique as like all the rest of the work they did suddenly has no value. But I think what we're missing out on as an opportunity is that we've essentially erased all of the stories of people who have done good work from marginalized or excluded backgrounds. And so when we try and find that balance, I don't know, in some ways it's sort of, to me, a false dichotomy is that there are people who are doing really great conservation work who have found and applied some solutions and haven't perpetuated either the colonial mindset or these harmful myths and narratives of our field. But once again, I don't think it's discrediting the conservation work. It's more about how can we see that what's good for marginalized communities is good for the environment. I mean, we can see it in indigenous and sovereignty rights when we think about environmental issues. Like the more we respect tribal sovereignty, the more that we solve issues of like pipeline leaks and the issues related to mining and things like that. The Pebble Mine right now is a conversation that's going on. And so I think the challenge I would issue is that we view diversity work or like equity and inclusion as achieving some goal that's in a different direction from conservation work. And we need to learn how to break that barrier in our own head to see how working towards both achieves stronger and better outcomes.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. That's a really good point. And then just one quick question and then we will be done. But from the YouTube chat, one of the points being made is that it seems that we need to promote both inclusivity and a devolution of control in conservation practices and systems. And so the question was, do you have any examples of tangible practices that really promote this release, this devolution of control to other parties that aren't white-driven conservation systems?
Yeah, let's see, a concrete example. So, right, I'm younger in my career. I haven't had as many opportunities to engage and apply this work as I would have liked. But I think, especially when we think about stakeholder engagement, typically the way we think about stakeholder engagement is that we've come in, we've defined, and by we, I mean conservationists, we've defined a problem, we have a set of solutions, and we say, like, we want your input, other groups, give us your input, and we'll take that into consideration when we select our solution. But I think having more of a reciprocal relationship where those groups are given the power to help define the problem and to find some of the solutions, that's a critical ingredient. But I guess one concrete example that I'm aware of would be in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, their Urban National Wildlife Refuge program. And that's the story of Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so there was land that was being sold, old farmland, and there were issues with it becoming industrial land or issues related to pollution. And a lot of the neighboring communities were Latino. And so it was an environmental justice issue of who gets exposed to pollution from polluting industries. And so the community banded together, and I don't know all of the details, but the community banded together to sort of preserve some of this land. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service met them halfway, and together they created this National Wildlife Refuge that is both co-defined by the communities there and by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's addressing both livelihood of local communities and conservation outcomes. So I'm sorry, that might be an unsatisfying answer, but that's what I got.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent place to end the video because it also allows me to kind of put in the teaser that we will be seeing some other future seminars in this series that talk about some of those tangible examples as well. So I would like to end this all by saying again, thank you so much, David, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. And if anybody has further questions or is interested more about what David is up to, you can go to the website again, like I said, in the discussion of this video, and you'll be able to find more information there. So thank you so much.